All right, I'm going to start the conversation, and as we go through, we will have more people joining the call, and I let them into the room. But I want to get this started so we have the main of our time spent for our panelists to be able to extend the conversation. First of all, I wanted to say thank you all for joining this call. It's great to get like another forum together. This group, the BSA SCUP committee, is managed and co-chaired by Debbie McDonald and myself. And we are basically trying to bring together a joint committee of Boston Society of Architects and the Society of College and University Planning. And it's basically the base of this idea. First, I should say thanks to Debbie and Dano, one of our mutual friends, that they started this group many years ago. And the idea of this forum is an opportunity for connecting with the two communities of both of these professional communities. And with this connection, we find synergies between common conversations and concerns of all groups, and the research and the design that goes towards addressing these concerns. And we have from facility planners, campus managers, and designers, and vendors, and consultants all joining us to be able to make this a vibrant and informative conversation. And then we basically design the sessions. We usually have basically a visioning session at the start of the year, and through the conversations and the questions that we receive and common topics that we talk about through that visioning session, then we start organizing the sessions. This session that you're joining is a result of one of those conversations. Our today discussion is focused on the embodied carbon on higher education campuses. Lemley will manage and moderate this discussion. For those of you who don't know Arndt, which I assume most of you know him, Arndt is an architect, certified passive house consultant, and sustainability lead at Dream Collaborative, an office catalyzing communities through inclusive design and development. Acknowledging sustainability as a human-centered concept, RAN operates with an acute sense of architects' responsibility to push for the greater good for both people and the planet. With that, I'm going to go on mute and give the mic to Rand and our panelists. Team, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Niusha, and thanks everybody for being here. This is a topic that I hold very dear, though I'm kind of an outsider to the world of higher ed. So it's been really fun to chat with these panelists over the past few weeks in planning this. And without further ado, I'll just go ahead and introduce our three panelists, and then we'll get into some short presentations from each one, and then we'll go into a broader discussion on what we've heard. And I encourage you, if you have questions, whether they come up during the presentation or afterwards in the discussion, just go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll try and keep that monitored so that we can get questions answered, discussion points launched, and make sure that you get out of this what you came here for. So first I'll introduce Kimberly Seigel. Is a research manager and senior associate at Perkins&Will. Kimberly has dedicated her career to working on interdisciplinary teams tackling some of the built environment's most pressing sustainability challenges, with a particular focus on decarbonization strategies. At the global design firm Perkins&Will, Kimberly wears many hats. As research manager, she bridges the gap between various practices and the innovative research happening across the firm. She also co-directs research efforts in partnership with Habitable, looking at the intersection of embodied carbon and health of building materials. Joining Kimberly, we have Dano Weisbord, who joined Tufts in 2022 and serves as Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Director of Campus Planning. This joint role is intended to further Tufts' commitment as a higher education leader in sustainability and climate. Dano came to Tufts from Smith College, where he was Associate Vice President for Campus Planning and Sustainability. He was responsible for projects at Smith, including the electrification and decarbonization of a thermal and electric district heat energy system and the development of a landscape master plan. Earlier in his career, Dano worked for CLF Ventures, a prior consulting branch of the Conservation Law Foundation. And in that capacity, he worked on projects in Greater Boston in energy and real estate sectors. And he also spent 4 years abroad working for ActionAid International and served as the director of Global Association of Corporate Sustainability Officers in London. And our third panelist is Keith Garrett, who's a principal with Affiliated Engineers, Inc., AEI, and the managing director of their Boston office. He's an electrical engineer who spent the majority of his time in recent years completing decarbonization master planning efforts for higher education clients, including MIT, Brown University, Columbia University, NYU, and Dartmouth College. In addition to the master planning projects, Keith's office is currently implementing decarbonization design projects for Dartmouth College and Columbia University. Keith will provide insights into the challenges and trends that his clients are experiencing as they plan and execute their decarbonization strategies. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kimberly.
All right, thank you, Rand. I'm gonna share my screen. Let me know if you cannot see it. Are you able to see it? Yeah, okay, great. So, all right, I'm excited to be here today. I figured we could kick things off with the time-honored quote, "You can't manage what you don't measure." I'm going to take a guess and assume that everyone on this call has heard some iteration of this sage wisdom before. You can't manage what you don't measure. And while this quote has traditionally been attributed to the renowned management consultant, Peter Drucker, after nerding out a little bit and doing a deep dive, I couldn't actually find the source of where he's quoted as saying that. And so I left it unattributed. But nonetheless, it seems like the appropriate quote to kick off this panel. Interestingly, as we convene here today, September 23rd, 2024, I am compelled to admit something to you, and that is that the same issues that plagued my research as a grad student 17 years ago, when I was conducting a sustainability audit of a university campus, are the same issues that I'm confronted with today as I conduct research on embodied carbon reduction and material health. And those issues can be summarized as twofold: a lack of data quality and a lack of data availability. So good data quality and availability seem to be elusive yet critical. And I want to kind of pose the question to the group of, how can we make a collective push for this? It's really worth calling attention to this and making sure that we're aware of the importance of data when it comes to embodied carbon accounting and reduction. It really is the gateway. And so this axonometric diagram that you see right here on the slide is really a great snapshot of where product-specific carbon reduction can happen at both the building level and even the site level. So for all the architects on the call, you've got your classic categorization of structure, enclosure, and interiors. And you'll see below kind of just a list of a handful of examples of material types within those sections. Calling attention to the right of this diagram, it's showing a range, and this range is equivalent to how much carbon could or could not appear in a material type, depending on what you specify. I don't want you to be too overwhelmed with this. What I want to emphasize is that the important thing here is that there is a lot of factors to consider. So the better your data is, the more informed your decisions will be. And I want to define better as referring to either quality, availability, or even abundance of data. So at Perkins&Will, we encourage all of our design teams to consider three distinct or different pathways of reducing and achieving embodied carbon reduction. Those three pathways are promoting circular design and adaptive building reuse, encouraging low global warming potential product specifications, and the third option that we recommend is conducting a whole building life cycle assessment so that you can actually optimize through knowledge. All three of those pathways or those options require knowledge of data. And while this might be obvious, it's perhaps worth breaking down. So let us count the ways data can show up. This data can appear in the form of understanding typical embodied carbon baselines and thresholds for a building typology. So on a campus, you have any number of building types, right? You've got labs, classrooms, residence halls, office buildings, et cetera. And each of those perform differently on average. So how do you know what's performing well? When it comes to products, it's helpful to understand the industry-wide baselines in the form of global warming potential via environmental product declarations, so that you can understand what this data means measured against something else. There's also data on product category rules, so standard quantities and viable low carbon material alternatives are all things you can consider related to data. When it comes to circular design or reuse, questions on the percentage of reused material necessitates a properly tracked database of existing material. And I can speak from experience, especially recently with research we're conducting. This actually is some of the most challenging information to gather, existing material databases. And if you're pursuing a whole building life cycle assessment, you'll also need to understand not only material types, but quantities. So once again, just emphasizing all the different varieties and flavors of data and how it appears when it comes to embodied carbon reduction. And many think that embodied carbon reduction boils down to the products being specified. And to some extent, it absolutely is. But the reality is that the process commences well before materials are specified. So like most things on a campus level, and I'm sure many of you on the call can relate to this, decisions are made involving a long process. They are involving a lot of parties. And the more available data that there is, the more informed those results will be. So it's easiest to make embodied carbon reduction a reality the earlier you start talking about objectives and goals. But since I've just kind of outlined how embodied carbon reduction is predicated on data, my advice is get familiar with data and ranges so that you as a group can collectively define and clearly define what reduction really means to you and your campus. And then you can eventually get there. And so this is my last slide. I just want to emphasize while data is key, I do think it's best exemplified with a case study. So I'm going to hand it over to Dano, who is going to wow us with a case study, which will hopefully drive home this point. So Dano, I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. I didn't know you were going to tee it up that way. Now I feel like there's a lot of pressure.
I'm sure you'll introduce Keith well. So
I want to just share a quick case study. I know that the theme of today's panel is about embodied carbon, and the case study I'm going to share is actually more about a carbon mitigation strategy that we undertook at Smith College. Maybe during the Q&A, I can talk a little bit about how we've been approaching embodied carbon at Tufts, so we can come back around to that. But I think the key thing is planners and designers and consultants of all sorts help institutions make change. And change doesn't necessarily come easy to institutions of higher ed. So I thought I would talk a little bit about change making and what's required. Through a little bit of just a quick story that starts here at this is sort of the end. This is what a good day at work looks like. This is the Smith College Board of Trustees and the senior leadership giving themselves a standing ovation when they approved Smith College's largest capital project, which was the transformation of the district energy system from a steam system to a geothermal electric system. Getting there is tough, and it took a long time at Smith. And I shared these 4 points. I gave a talk at Sasaki, so if there's anybody from Sasaki on the call, I apologize that you have to hear this again. But I shared these 4 points of ways in which consultants can really help higher ed overcome the hurdles to change. And those 4 things are, help us stay aligned to strategy. Often the client doesn't recognize that the institution has a strategy and that whatever the project is really ought to align that way. The second one is about the long-term shape of capital and sources of capital, just ensuring that understanding how a given project or initiative fits into the long-term capital strategy of an institution is really important. And then the last two, and this is where I think architects, designers, planners can really help higher ed a lot. And this is what I want to focus on, is opportunity cost and meaning and identity. In higher ed, when you go to build something new, particularly if it's energy related, the first question is, why aren't we using that money for scholarships? Why aren't we using it for faculty? Why aren't we using it for libraries? So that opportunity cost by spending money is always forefront for institutions. And then the last one is, how does it really connect to the deep identity of this particular institution? So I want to just talk a little bit about some strategies that we used at Smith to overcome those last two as it came to making change. So, right, this is the purpose of higher education. We produce students. Student on the left is Lucy with faculty member Alex Barron. Student on the right is Sally Robson with faculty member Denise McCann. And Lucy and Sally were on a committee that we put together to explain the technology and policy of district energy, of our district energy strategy. And in fact, here's Sally up in the upper right-hand corner explaining how a heat pump works to our board of trustees. The great thing about doing that is that the board didn't ask if this is relevant to teaching and learning, if it's relevant to our students and faculty, because we were able to show them, we didn't have to tell them. So there's a lot that goes into that. But let me just hop on to the second piece, which is sense of identity. Smith, like many institutions, is obsessed with its own history. And so when you can connect something new to something old, that really has a lot of value. And when we were looking at rebuilding our entire district energy system, we found this photo and a series of photos like it on the left, in which we discovered that Shepley Bulfinch had actually designed and engineered our district energy system. Shepley Bulfinch at that time was helping us redesign this building, which is the Nielsen Library. And so there was a connection here in 1947 between a new district energy system and an architecture firm that we were working with right now. Furthermore, in thinking about that new energy system, this on the right is an 1896 coal boiler house that was part of the Miss Capen's School for Girls. And that boiler house has now become part of phase 1 of the geothermal electrification, and that's where the new heat pumps are housed. So we have an 1896 boiler house that is now a 2024 heat pump house. And we had students actually go in here are our two students, Maya and Jess, in the Shepley Bulfinch archives, sort of unearthing more information about that 1947 steam heat system. And they went on to do a project. This is in 2019. You can see we used 2019 dollars, where they said, gee, in 1946, in 2019 dollars, the cost of that system was $50 million. And if we actually escalated that on a per square foot basis, we would be looking at a $70 million project. And it really helped our board putting this into historical context. Furthermore, they discovered when we unsealed the trustees' minutes from the meeting in 1947, where they approved a plan, that they did it not just for financial reasons, but to eliminate the trucking of fuel and ash through campus and the elimination of smoke from separate plants and the reduction of dirt. So it was a revelation that in 1947, they had built this new plant for pollution reasons, not just for financial reasons. And here we were doing that again. So there were ways in which we brought the planning and the design of this and the finances of this all together and sort of showed the board that this was relevant from a teaching, learning, and research standpoint. So that's a quick version of that. I can give a Tufts example later on. So I will pass this over to Keith, who I think is going to maybe give us a little bit of a deeper dive into into a mitigation project.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. Everyone got that now? Okay. So yeah, as an MEP engineer, the topic of embodied carbon is a little bit challenging. As you saw in the first slide, so many of the opportunities for sustainability or for specification of it come from architecture and finishes. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a step up here, talk a little bit about carbon accounting on a global scale, and then get into what we do in terms of master planning and putting together larger programs and plans to accomplish this. There'll be a little bit about embodied carbon in here, but to be honest, there's not a whole lot in here. So this may be a review for people, but there's really, when we start talking about greenhouse gas carbon accounting, it really breaks down into 3 areas. And you'll hear a lot about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And really for a campus, scope 1 is what's mostly in your control. And this is where a lot of our attention gets focused. And that's really the emissions that you're creating yourself. So if you're creating your own energy sources, that's what you're doing. And scope 2 is coming from the utilities that you're purchasing from. So if you're buying electricity, you're buying heating and cooling or steam, their emissions go into scope 2. So there's an indirect connection there for you. And then scope 3, the easiest thing to think about here would be fleet vehicles. It tends to be things associated with your operation, but for a lot of campuses, it's really looking at their vehicle fleet and figuring out ways to electrify. So we really like to focus on scope 1. This is just another way sort of showing that that's really in your control. Upstream are the things the utilities are doing, downstream are some of the activities, but the bang for the buck happens here on scope 1. Further driving that home, looking at possible ways to get greenhouse gas emission reductions. There are several. Again, if we think about facility energy, renewable energy, and electric vehicles, that falls into the buckets of scope 1, 2, and 3. You'll see carbon offsets on this screen, which is really more of an investment strategy to help you get to net zero. But if you truly want to be carbon-free, zero emission on your campus, you've got to really tackle the scope 1 emissions, and ultimately then you wouldn't need the carbon offset. So we spend a lot of time in the middle of the screen. Having said that, when we look at the life cycle of a building, and this goes back to some of the first presentation that Kimberly did, the embodied carbon makes up, it's about 45% of the total lifetime emissions of a building. But this happens early. In terms of the timeline, this happens at the beginning of the building's life, when the materials are being put together, the building's being built. The longer term impacts of carbon from the building come from the operations, and then for us, that falls into a lot of the cooling, electricity, and heating of those buildings. We like to look at both, but we're dealing with campuses that have a tremendous number of existing buildings. So the opportunities for making large changes in embodied carbon in existing building aren't as impactful. Going to what Dano talked about in terms of strategic alignment, when we look at these larger planning efforts for campuses, we really do like to align with the thinking on the campus. So right away, we want to talk about things like climate modeling and what is the campus's view of climate change model. And there's lots of different models out there. So which is the one that we want to agree to use for our master plan? What are the plans for growth for that campus? Are there any existing energy master plans in place? And you heard with Smith, the idea that they converted from steam to hot water. That happens a lot. So what's that strategy for the campus distribution? And ultimately, we start looking for places, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, for combined heating and cooling. And that's really where we can get the benefit. And then we want to talk about things like renewable energy. What's the strategy for that? Is the campus open to energy storage? Can we put tanks on the campus and start to help us really optimize the solution? So when we understand that as a strategic sort of master planning level, then we start looking at the buildings. New buildings gets to be, I'll say, a little bit easier. define the green design standards. There's lots now. Building electrification, especially in this state with the way the code is going, is really being pushed there for new construction. And ultimately, we're looking to get to zero energy buildings. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is on the existing building side. What do we do with this stock of buildings? So that's, for us, it's a lot of tuning of those buildings, auditing those buildings, and trying to improve the energy performance, and not only the energy, but also the systems. If we're talking about converting a campus from steam to hot water, there's a lot of conversion and retrofit that may have to happen in some of those buildings to make them ready to accept the hot water. So what does that look like, and how does that factor in? Saw this stat, just thought it was kind of interesting. It kind of reinforces the focus on the existing buildings. 20 and 15 years or so from now, about 2/3 of the global building stock will be buildings that exist today. And so of those buildings, not very many are built currently as net zero buildings. So without making changes in those buildings, we're going to continue to be emitting a large amount of greenhouse gases from those buildings. So we really do want to focus on the existing buildings and finding ways for improvement. So in doing so, we like to look at, we know that if we can improve the energy performance of a building, we're going to improve the greenhouse gas emissions from that building. So, and over time, as a building operates, its energy use will go up. The envelope ages, the systems age, the performance of the building changes as the building use changes. So how do we get that back in line, and then not only in line with where it should be, but how do we improve upon it? So whether that's retro commissioning, and for a large part of this is looking for energy conservation measures that can be implemented fairly aggressively to help start to bring that energy usage down, and in doing so, reduce the greenhouse gas. And if we do this on a single building on a campus, that makes an impact. If we can do this on multiple buildings, then we really are making changes that a central energy system can start to see, and you can start to downsize that central energy system, and then also look for ways to improve the performance of that. So sort of last slide in this topic here is when we're looking for ways to make changes at a global scale for a central energy system, we're really looking for those opportunities where we're heating and cooling at the same time. And then when we are, there's heat pump technology that can work to that benefit. And then when we don't have those options, we're looking for other sources of heat that we can move. We really think about this as moving heat around a campus. So simple idea is, a lab building, it probably, we're exhausting 70, 72 degree air out to atmosphere from those buildings a lot. Can we recapture that heat and use it? If we're not now, we should be. So we look for those opportunities. There are things on this slide that probably won't ever get implemented, but I'd like to try to look at as many of these options as possible with clients, and depending on where they are and what they're around, especially in an urban environment. The Smith solution used geothermal, which they had the land to do it, and is a great solution when people have land. If you're in an urban environment and you can't drill wells, you need to think of other possible sources. So looking at sewer systems, subway systems, places where there's heat that we may be able to use become really important. So I think I'm going to stop here, and Rand, if you want to lead us through some questions or open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Keith, and thanks, Kimberly and Dano as well. Yeah, so I think the first question that I have kind of relates to what Dano and Kimberly were talking about with creating goals, and this idea around stewardship, connecting the present and the future of a campus to its history. And what I'm wondering, I think my question is, what kinds of goals do you see based on what data we have available as realistic? And how can designers help institutions determine those realistic goals for a campus?
Who do you want to tackle that first, Dano or me?
Who's feeling up to it?
I mean, I'm more than
We'll give
happy
it
to
to you,
share
Kimberly.
opinions. I have plenty of opinions. So it's a great question. Maybe I can just speak from it more generally, and then Dano, you can kind of fill in the blanks with specific campus experience. I think it's really interesting, right? There's this almost like zeitgeist right now to tackle sustainability and carbon reduction. And it's the kind of thing that we've seen over the last 2 decades where there's this just groundswell of support. Sorry, I think I just got muted. To look at something that embodies sustainability. And so I've seen it come from bottom up, I've seen it come from top down, but a lot of times I've seen a lack of clear definition of what that even means. What does sustainability mean? What does resilience mean? What does carbon mean? Even on this presentation today, the title is Embodied Carbon, but we have very collectively looked at operational carbon in addition to embodied carbon. So I think definitions are critical before even setting goals. And I see that in all sorts of design projects. So I think when people set out to achieve something, they're either latching on to a concept that they may not be familiar with, or they're very familiar with it and they don't really know how to quite define it. So with carbon, with sustainability goals, I think it's clear to understand who are your stakeholders, who are the participants that are going to be involved. What are the goals you're trying to achieve? So if carbon is in fact the goal, carbon reduction is the goal, understanding your baseline of where you're at, and then defining what parameters you want to operate in. Is that looking at energy sources for your campus? Is that looking for material specifications for your campus? Is that looking for transportation offerings? Is that promoting something a little bit more holistic in terms of equity across the campus? Sustainability isn't just like carbon or environmental, it's a holistic approach. So I think when you identify what you want to do and then you know how you want to get there, that's this is speaking very generally, right? But like having those clear, concrete paths forward help. So in the purposes, like Keith brought up a really salient point, which a lot of people in the sustainability world reference, which is really important to emphasize, like by 2060, the global building stock is expected to double. That's huge. It's a huge impact on the planet. That's a huge impact on resources, on availability of materials, of landscape, of geography, topography. How does that alter society? So it's almost like inviting at a campus level, what does that mean? Defining what that vision looks like for you. That's why I think campus plans are so critical, because they really look out to the future. And I love that Dano referenced like the board meeting from 1946 or 1945. That's so cool that you're able to unseal those archives. So I'll pass it over to you. I feel like that was a very general way of answering your question, Rand.
Thanks, Kimberly. The goal to set is the most ambitious one that your institution will accept. And so I think where consultants can help is help us understand what the edges are to that. Because again, the concern always is well, what's it going to cost me? And how am I going to absorb that cost into all of the other things I need to do? I mean, at Smith, we set a 2030 goal in 2009. I really thought I was never going to be around to see that happen. And so that was not correct. And I didn't know what I was doing in 2009. And we wrote a really terrible plan and it was far too detailed. So now, at Tufts, we have a 2050 goal. I keep sort of saying that's not much of a goal when that's simply regulatory compliance in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we probably need to do better. And, I'm using consultants to help me figure out what better looks like and how to accelerate that from a capital standpoint and to include incentives and, all the carrots and sticks that are associated with it. So I think, again, I guess I just go back to, you want to set that most ambitious goal that your institution is willing to set.
Thanks for that.
The scientists don't like that.
So kind of following up on the idea of stewardship and this connection of present and future campus to what has historically been on a campus. Keith, you had this great slide of all these different strategies that could happen. And I was wondering if, similar to what Dano shared with the older building being used as now this home for heat pumps, if you're seeing other creative uses for existing buildings on a campus, and how are you seeing design teams interact with the existing buildings and helping campuses understand how to utilize them better? I'm going to come off mute. I think you're still muted, Keith.
There we go. Yeah, I was blocked from doing it. Sorry.
Welcome back.
So one of the interesting things that we're seeing in a couple of places, it's really not so much buildings, but getting in with campus planning, and thinking about, if we're talking about geothermal and talking about taking up acres of land to do this, integrating that with the overall campus plan, master plan is really important, because we can put those under a building when we build it, but it's really difficult to put the field there and then come along later and build a building. We have been doing some installations where we've been putting our plants under athletics fields and then coming back, and so we're in the process of doing one in California where we haven't completely put the plant underground, it's partially underground, and then we're putting a soccer field on top of the field, so that we're giving back some athletics areas and those sorts of things. The plants, a lot of the clients we're working with have, we just seem to be in this cycle where a lot of them have new cogen plants that are probably less than 10 years old, and trying to figure out how to make use of that investment. It was a significant investment that was made. We don't want to just throw it away. So trying to be as creative as we can to hold on to that asset and tie it into an overall master plan is one of the areas where we're trying to be pretty creative with it, as opposed to just throwing it away right away, especially if it's tied to fossil fuel, like I'm sure it is. So looking at creative ways to make use of that. One of the topics that comes up a lot here is resiliency. If we're going to convert over to a single utility, which would be electric, is what is the resilience on campus? So some of those types of systems, cogen will apply to provide some resiliency and some backup that otherwise wouldn't be there if you're totally dependent on that. And then within the buildings, we're converting buildings, a lot of buildings from steam to hot water, and it's that, depending on the age, and that becomes a challenge with the historical nature of a building. How do we go through a building and convert this system over? So that's also a challenge that we're dealing with in places.
That last one, Dano, have you experienced that in either of the campuses that you've worked with? And if so, how have you addressed it?
The cogen challenge?
Cogen and the existing hot water distribution in a campus.
Yeah, so yes, on both campuses, all the campuses I've worked on, and Tufts has 3 campuses, so we have the high density urban as well as the rural as well as the suburban. So kind of dealt with this in all contexts. At Smith, the whole campus is going to a low temperature distribution approach, which is great from a long range operating cost standpoint, high efficiency, low cost. It does really significantly bump up the first cost. And so you have to look at that in an overall life cycle costing approach. We did the same assessment for the Medford campus at Tufts, and actually we're looking at a much higher temperature water distribution system that we would turn down over time. And that's simply because the capital expenditure to change over those systems in the buildings would have gotten so expensive. So those are a couple of the issues around buildings. The cogen one at Smith, we had gotten the payback on the cogen that even though it was not too old, that we had been hoping for. So we're ready to sort of transform it. Remember, cogen plants are not one thing, they're many things. They often have chillers in them. They often have a lot of equipment in them that can be repurposed in a updated system. So don't like to talk about them as a single thing. That's the case at Tufts. At Tufts, we're saving a ton of money running a gas engine. So really we want to, but I think there is a big uncertainty in the world right now about that engine and whether in the future, as the Commonwealth needs more electricity, those distributed sources are going to be called on to produce more electricity and export it, and we're going to get paid to generate? Or is the Commonwealth going to say, no, we don't want you to use any more peak gas, so we're gonna ding you and we're gonna charge you for running your cogen at peak? And literally, we don't know the answer to that, and it makes the long range planning a challenge. So, you know, the cogen assets they're a many splendored thing.
So, Kimberly, the main thrust of what you were talking about in your presentation was this idea around data and the lack of it, right? And I'm wondering, you know, we say the word data and we can mean a panoply of things, right? And I'm wondering, from your point of view, what are the most critical data points when we're thinking about, one, embodied carbon on a campus, and two, taking existing campus assets and, you know, utilizing them to their best potential for the future?
All right, yeah, sorry, we're being controlled by our mute and unmutability. I feel you, Keith. So I would say the most important thing from an embodied carbon perspective when it comes to data, and just a reminder, because I think we didn't do what we typically do in a presentation on embodied carbon, is define it. So the definition of embodied carbon for the purposes of this call today is any amount of carbon that is released due to the extraction, production, transportation, and ultimate end of life of any material that goes into a building. So Keith had a diagram that showed, you know, the amount of carbon that's already in the building once it's built. So at a campus level, it's really critical to think about those components of what that means for embodied carbon reduction on campus. For the data that's really elusive to track, I kind of highlighted it, but I think it bears repeating. The data that's relevant to the materials themselves, the databases that track what materials are specified. So for the architects on the call, oftentimes our designs and what gets built are at odds. What we specify isn't necessarily what the contractor puts into the building. And so it behooves us to actually know what is actually the quantity of material and the exact type of material that is in the building. If that data is properly tracked and there is a record of it somewhere, typically it's a lot easier to then equate what that building material is in terms of carbon. And the database that you're going to reference for the carbon amount of that material is going to be found elsewhere, right? So it's being aware of the data sources and the data databases themselves so that you can make sure that you're well aware and you can kind of do the math accordingly. I also think it's critical to really understand material quantities. When you're targeting embodied carbon reduction, the most effective way to reduce embodied carbon is actually by not building anew. And so if you're going to retain the existing structures on your campus, or if you're going to reuse a certain component of the building that you're looking at, or multiple buildings on campus, it is really beneficial to understand what that material looks like, what's tracking, what you're actually conserving versus building anew, and then kind of specifying for any new material that's put into that building, how do you optimize for the lowest embodied carbon of the new material? So those are like the key data points I would say are worth tracking and paying attention to when you're looking at embodied carbon on campus in general. And of course, there's like mechanical systems, which we did talk about on this call, right? If you're looking at district heat pumps or anything else like that, embodied carbon related to mechanical systems it's still kind of a nascent area of embodied carbon, like to understand the carbon that goes into the pump itself. It's hard to get that data, but tracking every little bit helps so that while our industry evolves and more data becomes available, we can then kind of target embodied carbon reduction while looking at operational carbon reduction. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah, that also reminds me of, just thinking, backing up from the diagram that Keith shared of, it was 44% of the energy in a building is embodied carbon, which means that 56% is our operational carbon. If our current code, our newer energy code that we all love and adore, right? If this new code is leading us to like a 70 or 80% reduction in our operational carbon is now only 10, 12% of the whole building. And now we're looking at 80 to 90% of our building only in embodied carbon. And so it just makes that part of the picture, much bigger and that much more important to tackle. I want to open, is there anybody in the audience that has anything they'd like to add or ask our panelists?
Hi, this is Ludmila Pavlova-Gilliman. I'm at UMass Amherst, a colleague of Dano's. Our campus is also undergoing district energy exchange center building and distributed energy and thermal energy exchange underground geothermal system. So lots of what Dano brought up, but we're also in the middle of developing data to look at campus health, well-being, and connection as it pertains to the Okanagan Charter that we signed 2 years ago. And we have so many siloed data sources on campuses, and very few actually bridge the gap between the data that's collected on academic programs and the data that's collected for the physical campus use of maintaining of the physical campus. And that silo is really difficult to breach. And yet the sustainability conversations that we've been having for the last, 20, 25 years, certainly that I've been on my campus, continue to try to bridge that gap in data collection and continue to struggle to do it. We're in the Okanagan Charter group. We are struggling to figure out how to do post-occupancy surveys, for example, for not just existing, not just new buildings under the protocols of Lead for Energy environmental design, but also how to think of those post-occupancy surveys as a way of understanding the connections between people and the physical use of a building, and how to expand the survey to existing buildings, how to take surveys that we currently do strictly as, in a reactive mode to deal with problems that people experiencing buildings, and how to focus more on health and a salutogenic approach really to building, which is the regenerative approach that we've been talking about in building design for a long time. And so I think while you're doing data collection around embodied carbon and global warming potential, we should not overlook the toxicity component, because it definitely connects the capital project development to the toxic materials that are embedded in our environment. And also as architects, just as you're looking at materials, to think about both those things, both health and sustainability, broadly speaking, from a carbon perspective. And also just to keep in mind that health, safety, and well-being is part of our primary function as building professionals. And looking at the embodied carbon of existing buildings is still not really discussed much. And I love what Dano was showing in terms of how the students and the faculty went through the historical documents, understood that there was a health component as well that was part of the decision-making around new district systems, and that kind of thinking about the existing environment, the existing assets that we manage, especially those that were built in the mid-century, might contribute to transition us into a more adaptive approach in architecture, where we take and adapt existing buildings and prepare everyone over the next 20 years for the challenges that we will encounter when we do that.
Yeah, I think that connecting, I think just going back to the theme for the day, connecting the present and the future to things that we've done in the past is important. I think that's really the heart of what sustainability is. Sustainability, I forget who phrased it this way, but sustainability is really about just making sure that we're not making negative impacts on future occupants of the world that we currently live in. And I think you hit it with health and wellness. You know, carbon is certainly a part of the picture, but you know, more immediate like carcinogens and other bad things in our environment have a more immediate effect on the sustainability of our campuses.
You know, Lou, just to build on that, when we started thinking about the campus in 1946, I started thinking about how bad the air quality in the must have been in the Pioneer Valley in 1946 with all of the like industry and factories, and we've got a huge diversion there. And I actually sent a student out to try and find alums who could remember the 40s and 50s and if they remembered anything about the air quality. And she ended up just having a lot of like really great conversations with some really elderly alumni, but we really tried to like tie off that knot, but didn't get as far as we would have liked to have.
Yeah, it also becomes challenging when we're tackling some of these older buildings that come from the vintage of lead paint and asbestos, and we're talking about health and wellness, you know, just making sure that the right people are involved and can scope things correctly and investigate properly so that we're not causing harm for the future. Yeah, Kate. We're not hearing you, Kate.
Because this was up, huh?
Yeah.
I'm
now we got you.
Sorry. 101. I'm kind of curious to build on Ludmila's point and relate my question a little bit to this idea of legacy and the importance of legacy to alums that Dano brought up. It's really hard to raise funds for sprinkler upgrades or other renovations to buildings. And I think that embodied carbon on campus faces a sort of challenge when we are dependent on donors to fund projects. But I'm really curious about whether folks on this panel or others on the call have had positive experiences with fundraising when tying building upgrades of various kinds to embodied carbon goals and alumni's emotional ties to legacy buildings and to their campuses. Have people done that well?
We've never been able to execute on that. I always thought we would be able to, particularly that emotional attachment to a particular building and saying, we're renovating this building and didn't you probably went to school in that building and you know, I don't know, smoked in the stairs or something. I mean, we couldn't, you know, we really tried that. I know Swarthmore College has actually managed to raise some significant capital for their decarb district energy project, but I think that was from an alum who cared about that topic. We are much more often able to raise money for a renovation when it's what's going to happen in that building, and they're really excited about what we're offering to students today. And we're saying this building is going to be for student health and wellness, and it's going to be programmatically for that, and we're going to make sure that the indoor air quality is high, so their cognitive function is really great. And we've sort of ticked and tied all of those all that messaging. And I think we're more successful that way, sadly. I really have always wanted to do what you're talking about, Kate, but it's never sort of squares up.
Yet.
Yet. Thank you.
Well, and my hope is that the foundational work that we were doing for sustainability and carbon emissions reduction over the last 20 years, which is now giving some visible return, right, by our campuses investing in district energy systems and by the state certainly developing policy and then requiring us to try to meet those goals will also play out in this other realm of, how the foundations and how campus development for the existing campus will react and hopefully will develop a process to celebrate what we already have. There needs to be a general mindset around sustainability, and the next step is value what you have, improve it, maintain it, invest in it, and connect to the people and the alumni. I mean, our campus was built up primarily in the mid-century, and it gained a huge amount of square footage at that time, almost like 10 million gross square feet. Well, about 7 or 8 million was just built in that time period. And those alumni are now coming back, and they're old enough to think about what is their legacy to the campus and will they donate. And we have a UMass Brood organization that's trying to make them remember and then think about those buildings as part of their education, as part of their past, in a way that they could value it, so that they could come back and volunteer to help us do fund drives for renovations and for other improvements. So it's an ongoing process of building a culture of valuing the assets that you already have and using the teaching and research function on the campus and focusing the eye on the campus itself so that it can help the campus to maintain the culture and be sustainable.
Well, I'm aware of the time, and I want to just extend the opportunity to our panelists if they have a short closing thought before we go, if something from the discussion or something you want to reiterate. I'll just go from how we organize things at the beginning. So Kimberly, do you have anything that you want to close us with?
No, I think the most important takeaway is just no matter where you are on your campus, defining what your collective objectives are and what your definitions are critical to success.
Thanks. And Dano?
I didn't actually get to talk about embodied carbon, sorry. Anybody who wants to follow up, I'm happy to do that.
And Keith?
Yeah, I would kind of say the same. That we talked a little bit about embodied carbon and mechanical systems, and it's hard to find that data and hard to measure and hard to really see the impact. Certainly, we're looking at refrigerants and following that as one area, but I'm happy to talk to people if anyone wants to follow up afterwards.
Great. Thanks to the three of you, and thanks to the audience. I'll hand it over to Niusha, and Niusha, you may be able to let the audience know where they can find Kimberly, Dano, and Keith if they do want to follow up.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining this call. I know we are at the time, and I'm not sure how the BSA event is designed, if we get kicked out or by the time like we are done, I just drop off the call. So apologies in advance if we are all kicked out of the call. Thank you for this conversation. It was very engaging and very informative. I very much appreciate it. By next week, you can find the recording of this session on our same page, BSA SCUP committees page at the BSA. I can make sure to ask our organizer from the BSA to share list of your emails with me so I can send the link to you, or if not, please feel free to check our page regularly for the recording. Our upcoming session will be organized. The date is not clear, but it will be organized for sometime in November, and it would be focused on emotional and inclusivity of intelligence and inclusivity on campus, basically, and health and wellness on campus through the lens of materiality. I'll share more details as it's coming together, and thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of the day.